When the Santee Basin filled, families had to decide where to go. To stay, to start over, or to leave entirely. Some followed wartime jobs to nearby cities like Charleston or Columbia, while others went farther north to New York, New Jersey, and Maryland, chasing factory and shipyard work. For many, the Great Migration wasn't a choice, it was survival. The same forces that drew black Southerners from cotton fields to industrial cities were now flooding their land at home.
I think it's also important to remember that as this is happening, World War II is beginning. And so a lot of people that are leaving are also finding work either up north, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Philadelphia, in wartime industries very quickly after the flooding of the lakes, or they're moving to places like Columbia or Charleston to find work.
Between 1910 and 1970, more than 6 million black Americans left the South for northern, midwestern, and western cities. A journey fueled by hope and by fear. They sought to escape Jim Crow laws that made safety and rights conditional. Better jobs awaited in New York and Chicago, but so did redlining and housing discrimination. The same decades that transformed America's urban north reshaped the Lowcountry through water, policy, and displacement.
A lot of people decided to, it's hard to know who, because it's not like they're saying, I'm writing this down and I'm out of here. But I'm sure a lot of people also decide to leave the area permanently, which had already been something that had been happening this is by the end of this project is 1942. What we now know as the Great Migration starts in 1915 or in the 1910s, more writ large. So out migration has already been a part of the area.
Not everyone left. Some sharecroppers moved to nearby plots owned by their landlords or relatives. If a field wasn't condemned, you stayed and started over. Others moved to neighboring towns like Utahville, Moncks Corner, or St. Stephen, close enough to see the new shoreline, but far enough to stay dry.
When we talk about the surrounding areas, some people moved to other areas of land that they either owned, because a lot of the property, people might have lost some of their property, but not all of their property. And so you might simply move to, let's say you're a sharecropper, you might move to another part of the landowner's land that was, was still owned by the same person, but now you're sharecropping. Or nearby and you begin sharecropping for somebody else. You yourself might own land and move to an area that wasn't flooded of that land if it wasn't condemned completely.
After the flood, federal programs stepped in, at least on paper. The Farm Security Administration bought land to resettle families, leasing or selling plots to black farmers under tight rules. You could own your house if you worked 40 hours a week and planted what they told you to plant. The modern farm with old constraints, supervision without sovereignty.
But there were other options. One is that you could either move in with family so that you could maintain some sort of kinship network. So let's say, you lived in an area that was flooded by Lake Marion, but you had cousins that lived in Utahville or in Eddytown or in Pineville. You could move in with them, or maybe you could relocate your house if they were landowners to a portion of their land so that you maintain that connection. If you had enough money, you might be able to purchase land outside of the flood zone and purchase your own land, move your own home. That was very hard for a lot of people to do, but it was possible in some cases. You could move to one of the nearby towns and find housing there: Utahville, Holly Hill, Somerton, Russellville, St. Stephen. Some of the other options, however, had to do with the Farm Security Administration. And that was the primary wing of the federal government that was responsible for resettling folks. And they did that in a couple of ways. One is that they would purchase large tracts of land and then either sell or lease that land on kind of a lease to own basis to large communities that were moving outside. So you may have 12, 20, 25 families that would pick up and move together to a 1,500 acre tract of land, and relocate the church there. There was one of those in Berkeley County. There was another in Orangeburg County. So that was one model for resettlement. Another was that the Farm Security Administration purchased the land, and then they would build a little 4-room house, and you could rent that house as long as you agreed to work 40 hours a week, and you would get 25 cents an hour for your work. And they essentially dictated what you would plant. And the idea was to kind of encourage more food being grown rather than staple commodities like cotton, for instance. One of the problems was overproduction. This was a perennial problem with agriculture in the South going back to the 1880s, but it was especially true in the 1930s. And so this was not only true of the Santee Cooper region, but across the South, and even in the Midwest, the Farm Security Administration was trying to create these kind of model farms that would encourage a different type of farming. And some were more successful than others. Johnny Cash, for instance, his family grew up he grew up on one of those farms. So, they were all over the South. But that was one model for resettlement.
Technically, in the documents, when you read, the South Carolina Public Service Authority didn't have a resettlement plan. They brought in the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, eventually to handle resettlement. And what ended up happening for some folks is people receive money for the land that the authority wanted. There's a lot of debate around whether the land prices were fair. White people argued about that, like with the authority. I'm sure that also that just lets me know that Black folks probably got even worse prices for their land. And so sometimes that money would be held in escrow with the resettlement agent. And then when it was time to purchase new land, that money would be then used to purchase new land. But it would just be the land that would be purchased. There was little evidence to suggest that there was any assistance around moving structures. Usually Black people formed groups and they would remove homes themselves. There's actually photo evidence of this. If you go in the Library of Congress, Jack Delano took photos of this process, and you can see Black people moving their own homes. They moved their own churches. And a lot of times communities decided to resettle around the removal of a church because it was easier to do so.
In places like Orangeburg Farms, federal officials built prefabricated homes and taught families modern ways to farm, cook, and live. Lessons in hygiene and efficiency replaced lessons in community and care. Improvement was the language of the era, but progress was measured by control.
So the FSA had these resettlement areas. One of them was known as Orangeburg Farms. And I think that's where they had the prefabricated homes. When you read the documents, Orangeburg Farms and other places like it was to also teach rural communities how to be more hygienic, how to improve. It was a lot about improvement, which is very much in line with this broader conversation around progress. It's like, now you have these homes, this is how you exist within these homes, within these spaces, in this era of time.
The phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from Civil War Special Field Order number 15, issued by Union General William T. Sherman on January 16, 1865. A promise that each formerly enslaved family would receive land and a mule to begin again. Within a year, President Andrew Johnson revoked it, returning the land to former Confederates. Decades later, in the Santee Basin, a new promise emerged. Not 40 acres and a mule, but 100 chickens. Dr. Kelsey Moore explains what really happened next.
I'm laughing because in my recent visit to Moncks Corner, which is where Santee Cooper headquarters is, if you let Santee Cooper tell it, they gave every black family 100 chickens. And they gave them homes. But let's actually slow that down. There are what they say 901 black families. They say they gave every family 100 chickens. 901 times 100. How many chickens is that? A lot. I'm not a mathematician. Where are they getting these chickens from? Number one, who has that many chickens sitting around? Where are you getting that from? Also, giving up, if I received 100 chickens, I would actually be very mad because you had to feed the chickens. You had to create coops. Y'all would call these people poor. Like, y'all, they are saying that these people are so poor and destitute, da da da. Where are they going to get the materials to create all necessary structures to feed 100 chickens? You just took their land. You just took their house. It doesn't even make sense. Like, when you just slow down and think about that, that is not true. Even when I talked to a person from the area, they were like, no chickens were given. Granted, she was not born yet, but she was speaking about her mother saying like no chickens were given, right? Because they just lied. And that's been something that has been in the narrative for ever since the project's created. White folks in this area don't question that. But to get even more tangible, like there are many different ways in which people were resettled.
When the land was gone, people followed their faith. After the Civil War, black churches had been the center of community life. After Santee Cooper, they became anchors of resettlement. Communities rebuilt their churches, carrying fellowship beyond the flood zone. The church was more than a building. It was a map to belonging.
But those were in the early days. And I would say that in South Carolina, there continued, particularly in that area of South Carolina, there continued to be a sense that, the church was very much built into the social fabric of communities. This was true of, white communities, but it was also true of black communities, and that goes back to the time in which people were enslaved, and really, found refuge not only in the scripture, but in communal services that were often called, brush arbor or hush arbor churches that were held at night or, without the implicit, sanction of people, of slave owners. And after Reconstruction, or after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, there were two things that many black communities focused on early on, and that was the creation of churches in rural communities, churches, and then schools. And the Freedmen's Bureau came in and helped establish both of those. But churches really came to play an integral role and rural communities. And since we're talking about an area in which, we have an African American population as the majority of the population, they certainly had an important role in the Santee Cooper basins. They often did sort of follow the church in a sense, or even if they did not follow the church physically, continued to journey to the churches that were relocated outside the basin so that they could maintain that kind of congregation, that fellowship, that spiritual community. And in many ways, that became kind of an anchor after displacement. I think about Unity Baptist Church, for instance, outside of Utah, Bethlehem, outside of or near Inmost Corner. So those churches kind of important in that respect.
There was an interview that was done in the early 2000s, and people talked about how that area was actually very self-sufficient. Many of these smaller communities were self-sufficient. Yes, this is during the time of the Great Depression, but a lot of these folks are farmers. They do cultivate food for themselves. They hunt. They have plum trees that they can get fruit from. There's a lot of evidence of people taking, like, community members taking care of each other if aid was needed. Churches were also a site of not only like mutual aid, but also spiritual support, because a lot of communities develop their own churches. What is harder to understand is the spiritual loss, the ancestral loss. And I shouldn't say these are complete losses, right? I think they're maybe interruptions is a better word. You no longer are in the same spaces that you grew up in, that your ancestors have known for a very long time. You don't have access to your cemeteries. I couldn't imagine what losing my family's home cemetery would feel like. Even as a person that was born in late 90s, I understand how important cemeteries are to Black people as a whole, even in a whole different area. So I couldn't imagine what that is like. One thing that I think about is there's a woman, Dolly Small. She was interviewed by one of the cemetery investigators because her 6-year-old son, who had died in the early 1900s, was buried at Goshen Plantation Cemetery.
Before the flood, the South Carolina Public Service Authority sent investigators to survey the burial grounds that would soon be underwater. They went door to door and even placed notices in local newspapers, asking residents to name the dead and the living who remember them. But those official forms, neat columns of names and dates, could never hold what was really said. One of those voices was Dolly Smalls, remembered through historian Dr. Kelsey Moore's essay, "We Just Don't Trust Our Memories to Stone." In 1938, Smalls, a widowed Black woman in her 50s, had already known deep loss. A husband buried, 2 children gone before her. Her 6-year-old son, Frank, rested in the Goshen Plantation Cemetery. Small headstone, one of only a few among more than 100 unmarked graves. As Dr. Moore writes, what we do not know is whether Small's voice trembled or if she cried as she remembered her son and husband. When investigators reached her home on Barrow Hill Road, where she lived with her 3 grandchildren, Beulah, Jr., and Ava, they recorded her answers, but not her sorrow. The reports captured facts, but not grief. They preserved data, but not the sound of mourning. A reminder that even memory can be drowned. Most who lived through the Santee Cooper project are gone now. Their children and grandchildren remember fragments and a story half told. And it raises the question, who shapes the narrative? In the archives, those voices are quiet, missing from the records, or maybe I just haven't found them yet. That absence is what we call archival silence. To tell this story, honestly, is to confront that silence and to return the narrative to the people who lived it.
I think we're in many crises. I would say for the Santee project, for people who I would say are a little bit older, like 50s, they are remembering this project because they are the children and grandchildren of people who experience this project. But I'm unclear about how younger generations are thinking about the area, and thinking about the history. And we know that there is an attack on history. Like I said, for the Santee Cooper project, Santee Cooper essentially owns the history of this project. Field trip, like they can bring field trips to the different like generating stations and whatnot, and they get to determine what is being told to younger folks as people are passing away, because the people who experience the project, most of them have passed or they're in their 90s. The knowledge is not being disseminated and shared in the same way. And even when people were alive, they did talk about it because it was a very hard thing to deal with. And so all that to say, I think like memory is very complicated because some people don't want to remember, some people can't remember, and some people don't even know that there is something to be remembered. Like younger generations might not even know that the lakes are not real, like they were engineered. Part of what I want to do, and I've been thinking about it ever since I left Moncks Corner this past summer, is to meet people where they are and share information. I do have a digital project, but I don't even, because of the people who in the community who really care about this project, they're not that they're not online. Yeah, they're online, but they're not online in the same way. I really want to go down and do like community teach-ins at like churches and stuff, because that's where Black communal life still centers around in the area, and sharing the history that way. And this is not, and what I'm about to say is not just specific to the St. Cooper area. I think this is just happening in general with Black history and has been happening. Most people don't know a lot about Black history, and that's by design in some parts, and other parts some people think they know more than what they actually do, so they think it's not worth learning, because people really struggle with understanding struggle. They're like, I don't want to hear these struggle narratives. Well, babes, that is a part of history. I don't know what to tell you. like as a historian, things are saddening, but there's also, the deeper you get into history, you it's no longer, it's not like sad things happen, but when you learn about how people dealt with or created or negotiated, it's actually very interesting, because it makes you realize like how thoughtful many people were in trying to solve a conundrum that they did not create. And to me, that is more inspiring. People only want to hear inspirational stories. You lose a lot when you only focus on people who became millionaires. For example, I'm going to teach on Madam C.J. Walker. Wonderful story, but that's not all of it. Focusing on someone like Madam C.J. Walker, for example, or what Du Bois might call the talented 10, ignores the 90% of people who were still making a way with not a lot. I would encourage people to change their perspective about African American history, Black history, and more generally. And it's so funny because it's like people have casted Black history as a problem in the same way that like people always think that there's something wrong with being like with blackness in and of itself. Like, why are we blaming what has happened? What has happened on black people, and now we don't want to learn what has happened to them as black people? That doesn't make sense. Like, why are yet again are we being blamed? We should be wanting to learn that, not only as to just to know it, but also as strategy. Because I think a lot of people now, especially like when we think about like activism and organizing, part of what is so important to organizing is political education. Knowing what has been done before, why it has been done, helps you strategize better because you're not reinventing the wheel. You can identify systems and patterns. It's actually a very useful tool. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to know the details of every single thing, but you should at least be able to recognize patterns.
If we don't preserve our own stories, they become footnotes in someone else's report. Dr. Moore reminds us that history is not just what's written in official records. She urges us to collect our stories, church programs, family photos, recordings, to build communal archives where ancestors and everyday people alike can be seen on their own terms. Because when we document our lives, we don't just preserve the past, we shape how the future will remember us.
I encourage people to archive your own stuff, archive your family history, save photos physically, because as we are understanding of, you know, how things are going with the tech industry and clouds and stuff, we don't own any of that. One day they could just say poof, whatever. Start building physical archives for your family. Start communal archiving. Love history. Read more history.
Resilience is a word we use often, maybe too easily. Dr. Kelsey Moore reminds us that resilience can become a way to hide pain, as if endurance alone could undo violence. It's not about shaming survival, she says. It's about recognizing how the push to move forward can sometimes keep us from naming what still hurts. The people of the Santee Basin moved forward, carrying their land with them in stories, in songs, and in faith. Each memory, each telling, a way of saying, we are still here. Next time on Made in Carolina, we leave the waters of the Santee Cooper and travel north to the shores of Lake Norman, where new towns rose, old names vanished, and the past still ripples. You've been listening to Made in Carolina, created, produced, and hosted by me, Lolita Rowe, featuring interviews with Dr. Robert Hart and Dr. Kelsey Moore. Original music by Sister Sai. Additional sound effects produced by Saira. Website by Tiffany Macer-Bass. Visit MadeInCarolinaPodcast.com for show notes and more stories waiting under the water.